37 meters. That is the height of the nave at Chartres, not the spires, not the towers. The interior ceiling, the hollow space above the heads of anyone who enters, measures 37 meters from floor to vault. I had read that number in a textbook and moved past it the way you move past most numbers in textbooks: filed, accepted, forgotten. I had also accepted, without much examination, the explanation that followed it, that this height was symbolic, an expression of vertical aspiration. The builders, we were told, wanted the space to feel like reaching toward God. I accepted that. For years, I didn't question it. Then I started looking at the acoustics more carefully, and once I did, I couldn't stop. The official record on cathedrals is not dishonest, exactly. It's incomplete in a way that functions like dishonesty. What the textbooks give us is correct as far as it goes. These were episcopal seats, centers of church authority, expressions of collective medieval faith. The word cathedral comes from the Latin cathedra, the bishop's chair. That's accurate. What the official record is considerably quieter about is where else that root travels. The Latin pulls from the Greek kateirene, to cleanse, to purify, the same root that gives us catharsis. The term Aristotle used to describe what tragedy does to the body of the person watching it, not the mind, the body. The ancient world did not consider those two things separable. I want you to hold something while we proceed. In the 12 years following the fire of 1194, a fire that reached 1100 degrees Celsius and reduced most of the city of Chartres to ash, the guilds who rebuilt the cathedral installed glass that modern spectrometers now confirm transmits light at wavelengths of approximately 450 and 650 nanometers. I am not going to tell you what those wavelengths do yet. I am asking you to hold the number. Because the question that has occupied me for the better part of 2 years is not whether those builders understood what they were doing. It's whether we are willing to consider what it would mean if they did. Begin with what the sound actually does before we talk about where it comes from. When a human brain enters what neurologists call the theta state, oscillating between 4 and 8 Hz, something measurable happens to the body. Pain perception drops. Anxiety, by clinical measure, recedes. The nervous system shifts from a state of alert processing into something closer to receptive calm. Researchers have spent decades studying how to reliably induce this state. The most common modern method involves precisely tuned auditory stimulation. You feed the brain specific frequencies, the brain follows. Now hold that. Dr. Rupert Till, an acoustics researcher at the University of Huddersfield, published findings showing that the Gothic nave, specifically its geometry, its stone mass, its vault curvature, produces standing wave resonances concentrated in the range of 40 to 60 Hz. I want to be careful here because Till himself is measured in his conclusions. He does not claim intent, he documents the effect. What he found is that the reverberation time in these structures, averaging around 5 seconds, combined with their specific dimensional ratios, creates an acoustic environment that measurably affects the physiological state of anyone inside it. The standard historical response to this finding is that it was accidental, a byproduct of construction constraints. Stone behaves the way stone behaves, and the acoustic properties are a happy coincidence of the available materials and structural necessity. I want to sit with that explanation because it deserves fair consideration. It is not impossible. Builders work within constraints. Resonance emerges from geometry. Coincidence is real. But here is the problem. The same frequency range, the same reverberation window, reproduced within tolerances that modern acoustic engineers find difficult to achieve deliberately, across dozens of structures built across 3 centuries in 4 different countries by guilds who officially had no unified theory of sound. That's not one coincidence, that's a pattern. And the glass, which we haven't fully addressed yet, may be the part that makes the pattern impossible to dismiss. The glass is where this investigation gets uncomfortable. The standard account of Gothic stained glass is art historical. The windows were narrative devices, illustrated scripture for a largely illiterate population. Scenes from the Gospels rendered in colored light so that people who couldn't read could still absorb the stories. That explanation is not wrong. but I want to suggest it may be incomplete in a way that matters considerably. When conservation scientists at the Centre André Chastel in Paris ran spectrographic analysis on medieval glass samples from Chartres, they found something that the art historical account doesn't address. The cobalt blue glass, the deep saturating blue that fills the upper lancets, transmits light concentrated around 450 nanometers. The copper red, the color that dominates the south transept windows, transmits at approximately 650 nanometers. Let me say that again more carefully. 450 nanometers and 650 nanometers. Those are not arbitrary numbers. Those are the precise therapeutic windows that modern photobiomodulation researchers use when designing clinical light therapy for circadian rhythm regulation and serotonin production. Blue-range light in the 450 nanometer band suppresses melatonin and regulates the body's internal clock. Red-range light in the 650 nanometer band has been shown in peer-reviewed studies to influence serotonin synthesis in ways that measurably affect mood and pain tolerance. I'm not saying the medieval glaziers had spectrometers. I am saying that the wavelengths they produced through a process of empirical refinement that took generations happened to correspond precisely to what we would now engineer deliberately. The official explanation is that the pigment choices were aesthetic and symbolic, red for the blood of martyrs, blue for the heavens, and perhaps they were. But if you were designing a building to modulate the neurochemical state of everyone inside it, and you had access only to colored glass, this is exactly what you would build. And they built it across dozens of sites, which raises the question of who was coordinating the recipe. The question of who was coordinating the recipe leads, almost immediately, to a documentation problem. We touched on the etymology earlier, the Greek katairein, to cleanse, to purify, but I want to return to it now with more precision, because the linguistic trail is more specific than it first appears. Before the consolidations of the 16th century, the buildings we now call cathedrals were recorded in municipal and ecclesiastical documents under a cluster of overlapping functions. They appear in administrative records as places of worship, yes, but they also appear as places of convalescence, of dormitory care, of herbal dispensation. The historian Carol Rawcliffe, in her work on medieval English medicine, documented that by the 13th century, the great ecclesiastical complexes of England operated what can only be described, in modern terms, as integrated health facilities. Gardens cultivated specifically for medicinal plants, infirmaries attached directly to the nave, and formal systems for receiving the chronically ill that predated any secular hospital infrastructure by centuries. This is not a fringe position, it is documented. What is less documented, and this is where I want you to hold something, is the speed at which that function disappeared from the official record, not from the buildings themselves, from the language used to describe them. If this investigation matters to you, this is the moment to support it. Research like this doesn't fund itself, and the archives are not free. Subscribe if you haven't, and share this with one person who asks questions. Now, back to the disappearance, because the timing of it is not incidental. By 1550, across England, France, and the German territories, independently with no coordinated announcement, the administrative vocabulary shifted. The healing function is reclassified. The dormitories are closed, converted, or simply unrecorded. 3 countries, no shared edict. The same category of function erased from the description of the same category of building within the same generation. That is not drift, that is the decision. Which brings us to the people who built the buildings and what they actually knew. The term Freemason, in its original context, did not mean what popular culture has made of it. It was a labor designation. A Freemason worked with freestone, a fine-grained limestone or sandstone, typically oolitic, that could be cut in any direction without splitting along a grain. This distinguished them from rough masons who worked with rubble stone. That is the official etymology, and it is accurate as far as it goes. But there is a detail embedded in the historical record that the labor designation explanation doesn't fully account for. When modern structural engineers have surveyed the stonework at Chartres, Specifically, the column alignments of the nave arcade. They have found dimensional tolerances of approximately 6 millimeters across a span of over 100 meters. I want to be precise about what that means. Achieving that tolerance today, with laser levels and engineered concrete foundations, is considered competent professional work. Achieving it in the 12th century, with hand tools, on ground that was not mechanically compacted, across a construction period of 26 years with a rotating workforce, suggests something beyond ordinary craft intuition. The standard explanation is accumulated expertise, generations of trial and error passed down through apprenticeship, and that explanation may be entirely correct. But here is what that explanation requires us to accept, that this accumulated expertise, never committed to any surviving written technical manual, was transporting intact across national boundaries by workers who were, by definition, unbeholden to any single lord or institution. They moved between sites. They carried the knowledge in their persons. Remember that, because the question of what happened when that movement was restricted is, I think, the center of this entire investigation. What happened when that movement was restricted is not subtle. It is, in the historical record, quite loud. We have simply been trained to hear it as something else. In 1536, Henry VIII began the dissolution of the monasteries. The official explanation is theological, a break with Rome, a rejection of Catholic institutional authority, a redistribution of corrupt ecclesiastical wealth. That explanation is historically grounded. It is not fabricated. The Reformation was real, the political motivations were real, and the corruption of certain monastic establishments was documented and genuine. But I want you to hold one number alongside that explanation. In England alone, between 1536 and 1555, the number of functioning religious hospitals dropped from approximately 500 to fewer than 50. In 20 years, 90% of the medical infrastructure of a nation converted, sold, demolished, or simply closed. The standard account frames this as collateral damage, an unfortunate consequence of necessary religious reform. I want to be careful here because collateral damage is a real historical phenomenon. Institutions collapse when their parent structures collapse. This may be exactly what happened. But the French Edict of Turgot in 1776 abolished the guild system across France entirely, reclassifying skilled workers as individual wage laborers subject to state registration. And the British Statute of Artificers had done something structurally identical 2 centuries earlier. 2 nations, different centuries, different political pretexts. The same functional outcome. The unbeholden, mobile craftsman who carried knowledge in his person was converted into a registered, stationary, taxable employee. If this research is worth continuing, subscribing and sharing, it is the most direct way to support it. Now, back to what was lost in that conversion, because the buildings themselves still carry the evidence. The knowledge didn't disappear with the guilds. It was simply left inside structures that were subsequently redefined as something other than what they were, and those structures are still standing. Here is the shape of what we have found. A building material that produces a specific acoustic frequency, measurably altering neurological state. Glass pigments that transmit light at the exact therapeutic wavelengths modern medicine would select deliberately. A documented medical function that was erased from the administrative record of 3 independent nations within a single generation. A knowledge system that was never written down, carried instead inside the bodies of mobile craftsmen who were subsequently converted, by law, into stationary wage laborers. And structures that still stand, that you can still enter, where the frequencies are still present, and the light still falls at 450 and 650 nanometers, and where people still report feeling something that they cannot name. The question I cannot resolve, the one I have been sitting with through 2 years of this, is not whether these buildings were designed to heal. The evidence suggests they were, in some meaningful sense, whether intentionally or through extraordinary empirical refinement. The question I cannot resolve is simpler and more unsettling than that. If this function was documented, operational, and serving populations across an entire continent, And if it was removed within a single generation through mechanisms that look, from this distance, like policy, then what was it precisely that was being managed? The buildings or the people inside them? I don't have the answer. I want to be honest about that. What I have is the pattern, and once I saw it, I found I could not organize the evidence any other way. If you have a theory or a piece of this I've missed, the comments are the place to put it. This investigation belongs to everyone who's willing to follow the thread. The next video goes somewhere I wasn't sure I was ready to go. There are architectural drawings, fragments, technically, that were never part of any bishop's commission. I think I'm ready now. 37 meters, and we still don't know why.